Okay, guys, I want to jump back into on-demand reports one last time here and show you or point out a template called TTX Top 5 Metrics that every call center manager should know. So this is a great report to start from if you have call center work groups in your ShoreTel, and there's also one for the ECC groups. I actually have them broken out a little bit differently, but there's the same or similar reports on the enterprise call center side. But this is a report to look at is if you're a supervisor, maybe a member of the management team that doesn't exactly know what you should be looking at and focusing on metrics-wise with the performance of your call center groups. All right. So if you go ahead and click on Preview Report, you can see the 5 metrics that we're looking at. 1, the percentage of calls that are abandoning. 2, the time that the calls are abandoning on average. 3, the time that all calls are hanging out in queue on average. 4, the handle time of calls. So that's looking at talk time, wrap-up time, and a couple other things you can actually find out what that is by going to Edit and moving your cursor over the handle time average. So there it gives you a definition of what that's looking at. And then the percentage of calls that are transferred by agents. All right, so I just kind of want to step through these one at a time real quick and explain why we want to look at these. So first one, your abandoned percentage. Common misconception is that this should be 0% or as close to 0% as possible. Actually, industry standard is 4 to 8%. And the reason for that is if we're well over that 10, 15, 20% abandonment rate, we're losing too many calls, and it's a pretty clear indicator that we might be understaffed. Excuse me. On the opposite end of that is if we're at or near 0% abandonment rate, we may be overstaffed. So we may be paying agents to sit there and basically wait for calls, and they're just sitting there idle, not really doing anything. So that doesn't necessarily always mean that, but it's something to be aware of. And in that case, you could potentially repurpose those agents to another group that is struggling with a higher abandonment rate. That second metric, abandon average, what we want to look at here is compared to the queue average time. All right, so if your abandonment rate or your abandon average, so this is the time calls hang up in queue on average versus the time that calls spend in queue before answered by an agent. If that abandon average is lower than the queue average, then we already know that agents aren't probably going to, or callers aren't going to be willing to wait any bit longer, right? So I know this is a bad example because we're only looking at mere seconds here, but let's pretend this sales overflow group is actually minutes. So on average, calls are abandoning after a minute in queue. And on average, calls that don't abandon are spending 8 minutes in queue. So we can compare these two and come to the realization that we probably can't expect callers to wait any bit longer in queue, and we actually need to proactively start finding ways, whether it's staffing or some creative call flow changes, we need to start improving our abandon rate there. If that was flipped, if our abandon average was 8 minutes, and our average time spent in queue is only a minute, there we've got a lot of time, some elasticity, right, that potentially we could, if agents or callers are willing to wait up to 8 minutes before abandoning, they might be willing, the average call might be willing to wait a little bit longer. So we could actually potentially take some agents out of this particular group and move them to another group that is struggling with that abandon average. So it's just looking at staffing levels based on, percentage of calls abandoned and that abandon time average and the queue time average to kind of give you an idea of where you're at and maybe where you should be. The fourth and the fifth metrics there, the handle time and the percentage of calls that are transferred by an agent are really interesting to look at. And this just gives you an idea of our handle times. Similar to talk time, but also has then wrap-up time and hold time as well. So really, how long is an agent spending with each caller on average, right? So again, our sales overflow test group here, on average, 1 minute and 56 seconds. What's interesting, though, is look at the agent transfer percentage. So 36% of the calls coming in here are getting transferred. So this, compared to some other groups, could potentially be a very low handle time, and the agent percentage, or the percentage of calls that agents are transferring out to another group or to another agent is pretty high. 36% is pretty high. So what that tells me is potentially we've got a training issue here, right? Or maybe calls are coming in here that are flowed into this group the wrong way, and we need to be sending them somewhere else. This is really interesting to look at, because if this was flipped where maybe my handle time was really high, like 10 minutes, and my percentage of calls that agents are transferring is low, like 5%, now I know that those calls are coming in, agents aren't transferring them out for whatever reason, they're actually taking care of those calls. You can also look at those two metrics at the agent level instead of the group level. So this will give you a really good picture of potentially some agents that need training. I've seen situations where, the average agent spends 3 minutes on the phone with each caller, and then transfers out maybe 5 to 10% of those calls. And then you've got that one agent that's only spending 30 seconds and is transferring 50, 60, 70% of their calls. That would signal out that agent that potentially we need to meet with that agent, find out, do they need additional training? Maybe they're a new employee, that makes sense. Maybe they're just being lazy and we need to meet with them and do some type of corrective action, but gives you a snapshot and overview of, kind of the performance of that group, and even at the agent level if you want to look at that. So again, the DTX template top 5 metrics every call center manager should know report is a really good one to start as a baseline if you really don't know what metrics to look at. Hope that's helpful to you.